Welcome to episode 6 of the 6 Sims of Manufacturing podcast. I'm your host, Adrienne Temple. The ISO 9000 quality standard was introduced in the late 1980s. So why are quality systems and their values still so misunderstood? In this episode, quality expert and SCMEP Process Improvement Coach Deas joins us to share insight about quality systems and their relationship to highly successful organizations. Check it out. Hey, Stephen, I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast today. So welcome.
Thank you, Adrienne. It's good to be here.
I know one of the things that, your career before even coming to SCMEP, I know you spent a lot of your professional career working in, quality and some continuous improvement. And even now at SCMEP, we do a lot around quality systems.
Right.
And I think what would be really valuable for people that listen to this is, what is the whole premise of a quality system or the value proposition of implementing one? Because we still to this day do a lot of that type of work and still recommend it for those that don't have it. So can you kind of help to explain that a little bit more for those listening?
Yeah. No, it's such a great question. I don't, like you said, we do work with, I work with companies big and small. I mean, they come in different shapes and sizes. I mean, I can be working with a 5-person machine shop one week, and then the next week I can be working at a pretty, mid-sized tier 1 automotive supplier. And I mean, they sound like they're different, but what they have in common is that they both create something that customers purchase. And the other thing they have in common is they want their customers to be happy and satisfied. Okay. And I think that's the bottom line. I think we all know that. I mean, if you've worked in any business for a long time, you start to learn that that's the lifeblood of what we do. If we don't have them, we're not in business. But if you kind of accept that, then you start asking the question, well, how do I make sure that my customers are satisfied or happy? Well, you just don't get lucky. That just doesn't happen by luck. You don't pray a lot and, oh, we have happy customers. No, I mean, satisfied customers are the result of a lot of planning, a lot of leadership. And I think if I could sum it all up is, you have to have a system in place in order to take care of your customers. And again, it doesn't matter if you're big or if you're small, you have to have a system, right? So then the question is, well, what's a system?
Right.
Here's a very simple definition. A system is a collection of processes. And processes are just, all the activities that we do. And it can range from, we purchase things, we quote, we have sales, we have purchasing, we have leadership, and then we have, the actual processes we use to make the product it could be like assembly or machining, right? So all of those processes together make up what we call a system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, so then you have to, those processes have to occur in structured manners. I mean, again, you don't just get lucky and make satisfied customers. So these processes have to work well. They have to work well together. But then you ask the question, well, how do they work well? How do they work well together? Again, it's all about, you have to plan it. You have to put the structure in place. You have to manage it. You have to oversee it. You have to stay on top of it, because at any point in time, processes can go awry. And the consequences of bad processes could be that you're sending bad product to your customers, and then they start complaining, and No one wants to be in that situation. Um,
Right.
so that's um, so so when you think about a system, I mean, there's very specifics and particulars. There's I call it, there's 5 parts to a system, right? And these are, when I talked about, you have to plan a system. Well, the planning, it breaks down into 5. I call them, and a lot of people know this term. It's the acronym is SIPOC. It's SIPOC. You could say those are the 5 sections of a system. Okay. So the
Okay.
C, so the C is your customers, right? Obviously, you got to know who your customers are.
Hmm.
I mean, I know that sounds cliche, but do you really know your customers are? Do you really know
Right.
what they want? Like, how do your customers talk to you? Well, there are different ways. Some of them complain. Yeah, they may take their business elsewhere, or they may compliment you. Well, I don't care how they talk to you. You better be listening to them, because you've got to understand what they want. You got to understand, if you're not meeting their expectations or requirements. I mean, you better be listening to that voice, because especially if you're not meeting their requirements, then you've got to do something different. Something's going wrong inside your system, right?
Right.
So that's customers. But then so here's another simple. I said earlier that a system is a collection of processes.
Hmm.
Um, so here I'll broaden that definition. A system is a collection of processes, and the system takes inputs
Hmm.
and converts those inputs into an output, right? So
Right.
you have inputs that come into the system. So all those processes take inputs, and then something comes out of the system. And that's, it depends on the industry you're in. So it could be a service, like if you're a hospital or a bank. I mean, you're providing a service.
Hmm.
Or in our case, we work primarily with manufacturing. It'll be a product. Your system is providing a product, right?
Right.
So the customers are paying for that output. So the output of the system is the customer is paying for it.
Hmm.
So then you have output. That's the phase of this. That's the section of the system. So outputs have to meet requirements. Outputs are good or bad. So how do you know if it's good or bad? Well, the customer is going to tell you. The customer has requirements, like maybe they want it delivered on time. They want it to deliver it at a certain quality level. They have quality expectations. They have delivery expectations. They have cost expectations. All right. So are your outputs meeting those expectations? Are they delivered on time? Are they high quality? Is it a competitive price? All right. So you've got to
Hmm.
measure your output. You have to know, is my output good or is it bad? And if it's not good, you need to be doing things to improve the output. Okay.
Right.
Um, so and then, on the other side of the picture here is inputs. And if you think of inputs, I just simple way to think of them, they're just the ingredients that you need. It's like if you're baking a cake, right?
Hmm.
Think of that way. I always use this as an example. If you bake a cake, all right, so there's a process, there's steps I go through to bake the cake, and the output of it is a baked cake. All right, and it hopefully it tastes well. So that would be it. Hopefully it's a good output, and
Right.
whoever the customer is, it will be, if I'm serving this to guests at a party, hopefully they like the cake, right? So that would be
Right.
customers liking the output. All right. So how do I bake that cake? Well, I've got ingredients, right? You've got like flour, eggs, sugar. You've got an oven. You have like temperature setting for the oven. You have to have the person that mixes everything together, right? So those are inputs. Those are all the resources that you need to create that output.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
And what the inputs, we commonly refer to them as the 6 M's. It's the
Right.
six M's of manufacturing, right? They're pretty famous. I mean, everybody kind of knows these if you've worked in manufacturing for any length of time. Um, but you have to understand these because you have to, because the concept here is if you're getting bad output, and you have to ask yourself, why am I getting bad output? Well, because I probably have bad inputs. I could have one bad input or I could have multiple bad inputs. But if I'm not paying attention to my inputs,
Mm-hmm.
then I won't know why I'm having bad output, right? Um,
Right.
so, um, so I'm going on here. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in. I
No,
feel like I'm rambling. So what?
it is helpful to kind of understand it in that
Yeah,
context of kind of where it flows. I mean, because I
yeah,
think one of the misnomers about quality systems is, quality is solely an output, right? We
right.
solely look at, what comes out the back end. So it's, it's a quality product, it's a quality service, and
Right,
we only think of it in terms of an outcome.
right.
But like you said, it's a consistent thread. So it's more about quality at the source of all of those different steps along the
Yeah,
way,
yeah,
right? Which
yeah,
brings up a good point because and we've talked about this, just recently, is let's talk about quality control versus quality assurance, because
yeah,
sometimes people kind of say those interchangeably, but they are different.
yeah,
So kind of let's talk about that, quality control versus
yeah,
quality assurance. What is the
yeah,
difference in those two?
yeah. No, so I think when I think of quality control, I think of if you know the history of um, American manufacturing, quality control is what I would call like post World War II, where we were coming out of the war, and um, in the war, most American industries or manufacturers converted what they were doing into providing supplies to the troops, right? So coming out of the war, they were going back to what they originally were making. So you had this pent up demand in America, so which was good. But all of the American manufacturers now all of a sudden they've got all this demand and they just start making a bunch of product, and the emphasis was more on just make, right?
Right.
Um, and so there's a lot of inspection, a lot of inspect the quality, check it. We'll check it before we ship it.
Right.
We'll do a lot of inspection, right? We'll just check, and we'll sort the good from the bad. I mean, that's part of what I would call quality control, where you're just, and I'm not saying that same mindset exists today. I think we've grown up a lot. But what I would call a quality control mindset is where the emphasis is more on like the outcome, like we need to inspect the output. We need to do a final inspection. We need to do a lot of in process inspections, which are good. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would never advocate that we don't inspect, but that can't be your main focus. I mean, because quality assurance is more okay. The way I've always explained it is, I just always, I don't know, this is just the way my brain works. I think of like Google Maps. If I wanted to, like, I could type my address into Google Maps, and then when the map comes up, I'm looking at it from the what I would call you know the 10,000 foot level. But then I
Hmm.
can zoom in, and I can probably see me going to the mailbox. I mean, depending on what the picture is. So there's that, you know, quality control is that zoom in, and just get into the nitty gritty details of what's going on. Quality assurance is when I zoom out and I'm looking at the system holistically from a much, much higher level, right? Which you
Right.
have to have that mindset. You have to have that viewpoint, right? Because it's more than just, okay, you can't just say, are we making good product? I mean that's obviously important, but you've got to be looking at the bigger picture, which is, like I said, the inputs, the suppliers of the inputs, the output, and the customers that are receiving the outputs. I mean, you've got to pay attention to all of these phases. The suppliers, the inputs, how your processes are performing. Are the outputs good or bad? Are your customers satisfied? Are they happy? I mean, so that's quality assurance. It's just it's more at the system level. You're just looking at it more holistically, right? And it is definitely a mindset. I mean, um, some companies are better at this than others, but I think
Right.
it's a challenge. It is the challenge. I mean, you have to get there. Because I think, when I look back at my career, um, and if I, I've never done this, but I'm kind of thinking out loud here. But when I think of the really, like, what I would say, the effective companies that I've run across in my career versus the ones that I would say, they're not effective. If I was coming up with a hall of fame of high performing companies, I would say one of the characteristics that separates companies is just doing what I'm describing here, where you go into their plants and they've got a lot of visual management and they're measuring things. Like, they've got really good measurements of how their customers are their customers satisfied. They've got really good measurements on their outputs, like delivery, cost, and quality. They've got really good measurements on their inputs. Are their gauges um, being calibrated? Or is the material that you're purchasing, is it high quality? Are they getting the material on time? Are their people being trained? Are they being trained well? Are their machines being maintained? Is their environment safe? Is the work environment safe? So there's so many aspects of this system, but just having that, just a really good overview of how the system is performing. That's true quality assurance. And I would say high performing companies really get that, and they do it well.
Right. One of the things that, especially for some smaller clients who may never have been exposed to quality systems before, and it kind of speaks to what you're saying around quality assurance, is one of the things that we really promote to them about embracing, a quality system, whether or not they're certified to a standard, but just
Right.
implementing those systems, right?
Right.
I always think it gives you a heightened sense of accountability. That's
Yep.
really what it does, right? That you're looking at all of those things that impact the business and that you have a sense of accountability for those things. And to your
Yep.
point, there are measurements and checks and balances to make sure that you're doing things the right way, or the way that you
Yep.
have decided is the
Yep.
right way to do it to
Yep.
meet that end
Yep.
user expectation.
That's such an incredible point. And I'll just use myself as an example. I remember, this is back in the '90s. The plant I was working in at the time, we made this decision. Like, at the time I was there, we weren't certified to any standard. This was an automotive plant, but they came out and said, we're going to go for QS 9000 certification, which was that was the original automotive standard. So we didn't know what that meant. I mean, so we started this journey. So next thing you know, we're writing all these instructions and procedures and forms, and we just, no one could understand, and why are we doing all this? This is ridiculous. It's just an exercise, and we're just generating paperwork. Um, but we did it. And then when it really clicked for me is we started doing audits, right? We
Right.
were we they had people come in and they were auditing us. And next thing you know, you're getting this report saying, uh, there is no work instruction in the assembly process, or work instruction ABC is not being followed by the operator, or the operator, there's no evidence that the operator is trained to the work instruction. Then you start going, oh, okay, I kind of get it. Because I think ultimately, and this was the point you made, which I totally agree with. Yeah, there are written things that we have to follow, but what it does ultimately is it just creates this mindset, and it gets into this is cultural. It's in your it's got to be in your culture, and that mindset is okay. Whether I agree with all this or not, there's a right and a wrong way that we do our work. And I, part of my responsibility as an employee is I have to follow the right way. Even if I think there's a better way, okay, we actually have a procedure that describes how we change the way we do work, right? So,
Right.
you know, if I think there's a better way to do it, then I can voice my opinion, and we will get together as a team, and we will change the way that we do it. Like if there is a procedure, we'll change the procedure. We'll come up with a different way or a better way to do it. And then we start following that, right?
Right.
So we can always change it. It doesn't mean that it's rigid and it never changes. No, we always want to get better. We want to continually get better. And again, that's another part of a system is, but we continually get better in a structured way, right? Again, it's a mindset. It's okay. There's a there's a right and a wrong way to go about our business. And
Right.
and I think, to me, I could argue that's the number one advantage of having a system, is that it creates that cultural mindset of, we have to do things a certain way. And when
Yeah.
people and but inevitably you're going to have rebels that try to buck the system, and maybe they don't, but they stick out like sore thumbs. I mean, you see them because they stand out, because everybody else might be doing it the right way, but if old Joe over here is not following the work instruction, it's going to be pretty obvious, right?
Right.
So again, that's another. It makes things obvious, because if because now we have standard ways of doing work.
Yeah. And I like the fact that you point out, because I do think, and this, this goes beyond, I mean, this is even into the lean realm as well. We sometimes get to a point that we look at it and say, oh, that's a one and done. So to your point, even with the things that we establish with our quality system as here's the standard operating procedures, or this is how we
Yeah,
do this particular task, it's really not a one and done. So it's not like you're confined by what you were doing at one time, because your business is going to change. There's
right.
continuous improvement as an element of that. So like you said, you always want to get better at it. If there's a better way to
True.
do it, it
Yeah,
doesn't compromise on all of those other things you're measured against.
right.
But sometimes we do get in a bit of a fixed position where we really believe that now we're constrained by our own system, and that's really not
Hmm.
the case. But I do believe that's a bit of a misnomer about, once you do something, yeah, I can no longer change it. Right now I'm
Right.
stuck with this. And I feel like people need to understand that's really, it's iterative, because you will change and
Yeah.
evolve, and it will flex with you. You just need
Yeah.
to, even like you said, your management of change, right? The way
Yeah.
you do it needs to be very regimented, but it can be done,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I do a lot of audits, and so a lot of the audits I do are to standards. Like you have the ISO 9001 2015 standard, which is a quality system standard. It's a universal standard. So, and what it entails is that, if you have a system in place, you can have an auditor come in and audit your system to that universal standard. And if you meet all the requirements, then you get certified, which is a big deal. A lot of customers want that, and it could potentially mean more business for you. So it's a big deal to to be certified to that. And a part of being certified, one of the requirements is that you have to continually improve your system. I mean, that's a requirement. So one of the things I look for when I do audits is when I'm looking at documents, I look to see how often has this document been changed. Like I was in a plant not too long ago, and they had quality goals. That's another part. You have to set objectives. What are the vital signs that you measure yourself to? And their quality objectives were set like 15 years ago, and they haven't changed them in 15 years. And I saw that. I saw, so they showed me this sheet of paper that had the objectives, and I saw the date, and it was like when Obama was president. I mean, it was like 15 years ago. I mean, I don't know, but and I said, well, have you not changed your goals in 15 years? And they were like, no, not really, which just spoke volumes to me, right? Like, so when I look at documents, I look to see, have these documents been changed? Because, if I see like a procedure or an instruction that's never been changed, to me, that's a sign that you're not improving. Because most people are familiar with that term, continual improvement. All right, but what does that mean? Well, to me, continual improvement is if I'm continuously changing the way I do work, right?
Yeah.
And that's manifested. So the evidence of that is if my procedures are changing, if my instructions are changing. But if I see procedures and instructions that never ever change, to me that's a sign that they're not really trying to get better, right?
Right.
So yeah, which is
I,
hard. I mean, because you can get complacent and you don't. So that is a misnomer. I mean, it's not. You're expected to change what you do, right? I mean, that's an
right.
expectation
I
because
think that's
it goes back to kind of the premise we talked about. If you're paying attention to your customers, right? If you pay attention to the industry you're in, um, I mean, my goodness, look at just the last 2 or 3 years, just how business has changed. Are you adjusting? Are you adjusting your system to the changes that have occurred in the market, the changes that have occurred at your customers? Are you making changes within your system to better position yourself for the way things are being done right now?
right.
But if you're not looking at, if you don't have that holistic view of the system, then maybe you're not adjusting yourself for the new economy, whatever you want to call it. Um,
I think to what you're saying, I think it points to a couple of pitfalls of,
yeah,
when people go into this process of developing a quality system. One of the things is, to your point, you build it and then you don't touch it.
right.
Right. You just sort of, and to your point, it's not very dynamic. It's not responsive to the market. It's not adjusting to anything that you change or improve in your process. So you're not responding to that and adjusting your procedures. I think it'd be good to kind of touch on what are some of the stumbling blocks or pitfalls that can happen when you start implementing a quality system. One of those being it's the maintenance of the system, right? It's the continual
Yeah.
change and adjustment. I think one of the other things that I've found that's painful is sometimes we write our system to who we want to be. We put a lot of extra bells and whistles in there that we don't accurately uphold or are not really representative of how we truly operate, but we want to be this sort of better version of us. And so
Yeah.
what it does is it sets us up for failure, right?
Yeah.
We overcommit to what we could even really do consistently and maybe write our system to be far more than what we actually do, which is where the audits kind of come in. But what are
Yeah.
some of the other, speak to those, or others that you think are just really common stumbling blocks or things that, false starts when you're implementing a
Yeah.
quality system? Anything
Yeah.
you can think of?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as I hear you describe that, I think of Plan, Do, Check, Act. I think we're all familiar with that acronym, and so PDCA. I call it the engine that drives your quality system. That's what it is. I mean, it's used for another. It's used in different scenarios, but it very much applies to a quality system. So you have to plan your system. You have to plan it. We talked about that. Then the do part is you have to implement your system. So implementing means I got to write my procedures, I got to write the instructions, and I have to train everybody to the documentation. We have to start using, the way we work has to be in accordance with what we wrote. That's the do part. But then you have to check it. Okay. Is this system working? Is it effective? Um, and that's where like audits come in, because we have to check, are we following the instructions, are we following the procedures, are there any weaknesses in the system. This is being very proactive and being very preventive. Auditing is preventive by nature. And then based on what we're learning from our audits, um, the act part is we got to take some sort of action. We have to either correct it if it's not working, or, the other form of action is just continual improvement, right? Even if it's not broken, we still need to take actions to make it better. So I think the pitfall. So with all that being said, I think, to me, two of the biggest pitfalls I see. Number one is not doing audits, or not doing them well. Either you're not doing them frequently enough, or you're just not doing them well. I see too many companies that they do audits because they're supposed to. I mean, you have to, like, especially if you're certified. I mean, that's a requirement. You have to audit yourself. So they just do it to do it. They don't really do it. They don't really embrace it as a tool. And it's such a powerful tool, because I always ask this question when I do training. How do you know that your system is effective? Because there's two things a system has to be. It has to be conforming, and it has to be effective. Conforming means, like, it's certified to a standard, and I have the certificate hanging in my lobby to prove that. But that doesn't mean that your system is effective.
Right.
So, but to me, that the more important one is, how do you know that your system is effective? When I ask that question, a lot of times, I would say the immediate answer I usually get is, well, if my customers are happy, and if my customers are satisfied. And I agree with that, but that's such a lagging indicator, right? It's just after the fact, and it makes you're reactive.
Exactly.
Especially if they're not happy, then at that point you're correcting things. You're responding, you're correcting, you're firefighting. Well, how about us be more preventive, right? The truest way of knowing if your system is effective is if you're checking your processes. And that's where auditing comes in. If we're frequently auditing our processes, and if we're finding the weaknesses, if we're finding the gaps in our processes, if we're finding the examples where maybe we're not doing something well, and as long as we're closing the gaps and making the improvements, I mean, that's just being more preventive. We're mitigating risk at that point. And the ultimate, the consequence of that is less customer complaints. I mean, it just makes sense. Where am I going to focus my time, on being reactive or being more preventive? But so I think one pitfall is just not embracing that, of auditing. and when I say embrace, like if you do one audit a year just to say you've done it, nah, you're not embracing it. But versus if you're doing audits like maybe once a month, which means you're collecting a lot of valuable information about your system, I think that's truly embracing it. And I think the other pitfall that I see a lot, it just boils down to leadership. Because a lot of this is cultural. So I'll use auditing as an example. So let's say you're doing a lot of audits, and the audits are telling you where your needs for improvement are. But let's say that the leadership being like your key decision makers, like your plant managers, your production manager, your quality manager. If those leaders aren't paying attention to what the audits are saying, I always say audits are a leader's best friend. That's what they are. But if your leaders are not paying attention to what the audits are saying, then you're missing opportunities here. On the other hand, if your leaders are hungry to know what the audits are saying, if the leaders are taking the feedback they're getting from the audits, and if the leaders are saying, okay, here's what the audits are telling us, how can we as a leadership group, what are the things we need to do to make our system better, right? That's pretty powerful when it starts happening that way. But when that doesn't happen, that's a big pitfall. Just the lack
Yeah.
of leadership, the lack of focused leadership. Because it goes back to that quality control versus quality assurance mindset. If you're more focused on make the product, get it out the door, get it to the customer. If the customer's not happy, we'll respond versus, all right, let's take a step back and let's look at how we're doing. We've got to spend some time looking at the whole system. Okay, is everything going well? Or are there any risks that we need to be aware of? Just you got to do that, right? But not everybody does.
It's good that you bring up the audits because it's a very good point. And I've been an internal auditor for several years whenever I was still in the plant. And, I always kind of took the approach, really what you're saying is when it comes to audits, especially if you are certified to a system and you have internal auditors, this is your first line of defense is my thing. It's internal. You're really looking at your own system. Your job is really to find the failures. Where is it not working? And then let's figure out why. Because if you don't, you do put yourself at risk, not only for obviously maintaining your certification, but to your customers. But a lot of times, and probably some of this is leadership influence or just general opinion about, the audit, and, nobody wants to find anything, right? That's bad. Because if we find something, that means somebody's not doing their job, which is really not true. I mean, because you're constantly changing, whether it's business conditions, the way that you're running, what your product mix is, you may be taking on a lot of new employees at the time. The opportunity is always there for something to slip through the cracks, to change without being documented. That's just real life, right? Sure. But your audit is your opportunity to look at what you're doing and kind of get a pulse or a read. And like you said, let's make some adjustments. Why is it failing? But we get this sort of go the other side, and it's like, oh, I don't want to find anything. Like we don't want to know that it's not going right. But you're completely derailing all of your efforts to be an effective supplier to your customer, to be a high performing or efficient operation. But do you see some of that as well? Do you see that sort of, well, we don't really want to find anything here, this is not, we don't want to do that? Do you see that?
Absolutely. I think part of that is leadership. I think auditors can't audit in fear, right? Like I can't be afraid to point something out, but a lot of auditors do, and blame's wrong word. I mean, I attribute that to leadership, because what culture has leadership created? If they've created a culture of, we're going to do these audits and I want you to tell me where the risk is. I want you to, this is leaders talking to auditors. If the auditor is working in the culture of, I am encouraged to go out here and do my best and audit these processes thoroughly. I'm encouraged to document what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. And I know and I trust that those above me are going to take this information that I give them and do something with it. If that's the culture, then my goodness, you're, again, that's I think in the long run, you're talking about a successful organization there, versus if the culture is, don't point out a problem, no, don't do that. If that's the mindset of the auditor, well, someone created that mindset for her, I mean, or him. And
Right.
yeah, I see that a lot for sure. I always tell this story. I ran across this company one time, and the initial conversation I had with the plant manager was, "Man, we're having all these customer complaints. I don't really understand why." And he says, "Kind of like whack-a-mole. We'll put one problem out, and then another problem pops up, and then we fix that problem, and then another problem pops up. So it's like totally reactive, sucking up all his resources, miserable work environment." And he was asking for my help on it, and just hearing him describe it, it just reeked of a totally ineffective system. Because
Yeah.
I always say, well, and I told him, I said, well, one thing your system's really good at, and I sarcastically said, and you should feel good. You're really, really good at sending problems to your customer. Your system's really good at that. It's predictable. So if you're good at one thing, if your system's good at one thing, it's sending bad product to your customer. So, obviously that's sarcastic, but it also makes a point that, okay, why is your system constantly sending bad output to your customers? Well, there's no
Right.
one thing that you go point out. It's there's something's going on within your system. Okay. So the other conversation I had with him, I said, well, how often do you do internal audits? And he goes, well, we do them. They were ISO certified. He goes, well, we do one audit a year. And when do you do it? Well, we do it at the end of the year. And it was a classic. We just do it to get it done. So I
Yeah.
said, all right, well, I'd like to see your last 4 years of audits, 4 year of audit reports. So we had the quality manager bring me, this stack of audit reports. So I started looking through the audit reports. Not a single issue brought up in the audits. No problems. I did a few little minor things here and there. And I just looked at them and I said, all right, let's put this together. On the right side, on the output side of your system, you got customers screaming at you. You got customers constantly telling you that there's something wrong, right? And on the other side, on the input, on the process side, you got your own audits telling you that there's nothing wrong.
Something doesn't add up.
Something doesn't add up, right? Yeah. So part of what we did is first of all, we started doing more audits. We started doing it once a quarter instead of once a year. And then we changed the way we were doing audits. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation we can get into, but just the mechanics of how you do an audit. And then also the reason I'm being long-winded here, it's that mindset of not being, they had part of it, they had a mindset is let's don't point out mistakes, right? So that was part of it. So when we changed the mechanics of the audits, we made it very, very clear. Listen, if there's an issue, you're going to put it in the audit report, and we're going to get these issues fixed. And then lo and behold, what do you know? We start doing the audits, and we start finding problems. We found, people that weren't trained. We found work instructions that were at the wrong revision level being used. We found gauges that weren't calibrated. Just typical problem. So no wonder now, once we started getting the audit from the data, from the audits, then you sit there and you go, well, no wonder our customers are complaining. Our system is a mess. Our system is totally ineffective, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing as kind of just, your personal wellness, right? Just because you avoid getting the information and you don't want to know,
Yeah.
you're still going to continue to get the same outcome, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you don't, knowing and giving you an opportunity to change something will change the outcome. If you
Yeah.
choose to ignore and don't want to know,
Right.
you're going to continue to, lead towards certain outcomes that may have been preventable, right? So it's
Yeah.
kind of the same thing as just general health and wellness of your organization, of your system. But
Yeah.
not wanting to know is not going to be the answer, and is certainly
Right.
not going to help you change anything,
Right.
for sure. I think before we close this out, when you look at all the experience that you've had both working in manufacturing and being in the quality arena, as well
Mhm.
as what you've seen kind of being exposed to all these other industries in the sort of the service sector with SCMEP, I mean, what kind of advice would you give if we've got people out there listening that are, either just thinking about getting started? I know we've talked about some of the pitfalls and stumbling blocks and kind of defined what quality is really about, what quality systems really do. But any advice that you would give to somebody who's on the cusp of embracing maybe developing a quality system or going further down that path? I mean, any advice that you would offer before we close this out?
Um, I think, yeah. Let me see. So I think one important piece of advice is you have to be measuring things. I mean, you have to you have to know. Well, let me back up. Let's keep it really simple. I like, what are your vital signs? I call it. I always think of the medical analogy. When you go to the doctor, I don't care what's wrong with you. You could be walking in there in extreme pain, or maybe your arm is at a 90-degree angle. It's broke. I don't care what's wrong with you. There's probably 4 or 5 things they're going to measure, right? They're
Right.
going to check your blood pressure, check your pulse, weigh you. But what are those for your business, right? You have to know what those are. You have to measure those. So that's, if you know it. Well, first of all, you have to know what they are. You have to determine what they are, um, and then you have to be measuring them. You have to be collecting the data, and then you have to be. But then once you get the data, then you have to be able to say, well, what is this telling me, right? And then once you understand what it's telling you, what am I going to do, right? And what I just described there is just it's just going to make you look holistically at your business, right? And whether you know it or not, you're that's kind of the first step of creating a system. Is okay, just how are we doing? And don't just focus on quality or um, call. But obviously, you think of the safety, quality, delivery, cost. I mean, those are kind of the categories we're talking about. I think that's always a good step. Um, you It's just what's important to me. What are the key things I need to measure, right? And that's going to tell you a lot about. If you don't like what you're seeing when you do that measurement, then you need to start thinking about, okay, well, then maybe I need to put some standard practices in place. A lot of
Absolutely.
companies will say, well, we don't need work construction. Yeah, and that's, I would never tell somebody, oh, you have to have a work construction. If it doesn't fit your business, it doesn't fit your business. But at some point you have to ask yourself, do we need to put standard practices in place? Right. But I think that stems from just doing that initial, you know, measurement of how we're doing. Because if your costs are out of whack, if your quality is not really good, if your delivery is not good, then you've got to do something, right? You got to do something. You can't. That's not a sustainable business model. So, I would argue with anyone, so what is it that you need to do? I would always argue whether you've got to put a system in place. Whether you're going to go for certification or not, you've got to put some structure in place. And it doesn't mean we're going to write 500 work instructions. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that we've got to put some structure around what you're doing. And I can't promise someone this, but I could almost promise them, if you do put that structure in place, those key things that you're measuring, they're going to get better over the long run.
Well, Stephen, I really appreciate you spending time with us to go over some of these concepts of quality. I think it's obviously a consistent thread of discussion with a lot of people that we serve, and hopefully those that are on the fence or maybe not familiar with quality systems learned a few things today. But thank you so much for your time. It's really been a pleasure having that time to sit down with you.
Thank you, Adrian. I really, really enjoyed it, and hopefully this is helpful to those that get to watch it. So.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the 6 M's of Manufacturing podcast. Thanks to my colleague, Stephen Deas, for sharing his perspective and expertise related to quality systems and continuous improvement. Visit the episode notes for details and reference links to information shared during today's discussion. Did you enjoy this episode? That's awesome. Follow our podcast and share with your network. And remember, don't just make it better.